Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Barsanti. I am the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. It's a long phrase. It is really great to be able to welcome a number of you back in person and to have a little exhibition opening and reception. It feels like it's been a long time since we've done that. So it is great to welcome you back. I am here tonight to welcome all of you here in person and all of you tuning in remotely to an opening of this wonderful new exhibition called Hearing Voices, as well as, this is a 2-for-1 tonight, we are launching a new publication. This is a publication by our partner at Lanternfish Press that is called Under That Calamity. You'll be hearing more about it shortly, but it is related to, it is a reprinting of one of the narratives that's in the exhibition. I've been looking forward to this exhibition for some time. The curator of printed books, Rachel D'Agostino, I remember one of the first conversations I had with Rachel here at the Library Company 5 years ago. She was talking to me about her interest in doing an exhibition about mental health and about the way the collection reflected changing understandings of mental health over time. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. That was further supplemented by the gifts of our trustee emeritus, Charles Rosenberg, and an incredible collection of, which Rachel and Sophia will talk about in more detail, but an amazing collection of insanity narratives that became then the basis for the exhibition. So without any further ado, I'm really looking forward to introducing you and inviting up to speak Rachel D'Agostino, who is our curator of printed books, and Sophia Dahab, who is the assistant curator of printed books, who have together co-curated this fantastic new exhibition called Hearing Voices. Please come on.
Thanks, Mike. Let's see. All right, I'm exposed. For the folks on Zoom, I guess you can see me. I took my mask off, right? It's not, they're not just hearing me. Okay, wonderful. Hi, I am Rachel D'Agostino. Welcome to our exhibition opening and book launch. We are so excited to have you here. And as Mike just mentioned, I can't believe he remembers it, but yeah, this has been on my mind for a long time. The collection that we have is really rich, and just take 2 minutes to tell you about that and where it fits in with the rest of our holdings. We have what we consider a large popular medicine collection, and we define popular medicine fairly broadly to include both materials that were written and produced for the public about medicine, as well as materials that were produced for professional audiences, but in relation to issues impacting public health and the individual in the home as well. So with this collection, which was built in very large part thanks to the donations of Charles Rosenberg and the late Bill Helfand, we are able to tell stories about all aspects of early American life through this lens of how people were interacting with their own medical needs, the needs of their families, and then how they were building up institutions to support the Commonwealth and the nation at large, to protect those in the citizenry who needed extra support. So this included almshouses, schools for the deaf, schools for the blind, and other institutions supported by philanthropy. And among those are asylums. And within that same popular medicine collection, a large clutch of materials are what we consider insanity narratives. That's the colloquial term. And many of those were donated to us by Charles Rosenberg, and we had some in our collection already as well. And those formed the centerpiece of this exhibition, really the starting point. It allows us to approach the subject of mental illness and mental health care in 19th century America from the perspective of those who were living with mental illness or who were cast as someone living with mental illness, whether they were in reality or not. So these narratives, some of them tell about a positive experience where help was needed and was then received at an asylum. Others tell of more harrowing, disturbing experiences where they should not have likely been institutionalized, and how did that negatively impact on their lives. Some of these narratives were created in order to raise money for someone's own needs or to make changes as well. And in fact, the individual whose insanity narrative Lanternfish Press has published and Lindsey worked to edit was one of these in which the author was interested in making positive change. And in fact, he pushed to institute a number of changes in the 1840s and 1850s in England that did not come to fruition actually until very recently. But his ideas were perhaps more in line with ours today than you might expect. So I hope that you have a chance to look at the exhibition, and I hope that you also keep your eyes and ears open for more from the library company in terms of a popular medicine program and how we will continue to use those collections. But we, Sophia and I really want the exhibition to speak for itself. And to be honest, we have spent a lot of time sort of buried in it for a long time now. And we really hope that it does speak for itself. So I don't know that we need to say anything further, except we would both like to say some thank yous at this moment. So tolerate this because it's long, but these people all deserve it, very much so. At Lanternfish Press, with whom we worked to publish, they are the publisher, this volume. This has been a really wonderful experience to work with a publisher today to produce a volume of from our collections, to get that out into the hands of the modern reader. It does need some help from an editor, and Lindsey Grubbs stepped in to fill that role wonderfully, because it's a little bit difficult sometimes to work with a novel from 1838 or any literature from a fair amount of time ago and really feel comfortable having that conversation with the author. So Lindsey helps us to have that conversation, and Lindsey is a former fellow at the library company. So we're very happy to have her back here with us today, and just thrilled to have done that project with Lanternfish. So I want to specifically thank Amanda Thomas, Christine Newley, who's here this evening, Aubrey Norman, and Felisa Casano at Lanternfish Press, and Will Fenton as well, who is here now, was on staff at the library company back when we started having these conversations and brought those first conversations with Lanternfish to the library company. So very happy that you could join us. Some non-LCP folks or non-staff folks that I would also like to mention briefly: Barb Barnett, who is a designer who worked on the exhibition, Stephen Peitzman, Charles Rosenberg, of course, and a bloke named Eric Omquist, who is not here, but he's super helpful to me in my life. So I'm going to mention him, and my own children, I will mention them as well. So folks at LCP, this is like almost everybody, but I have to call out some names. I'll be quick, I promise. Blanche Brown, Katie Maxwell, Dana Dorman, Rachel Hammer. The list is long because this show, while it really was a lot of work, obviously, for Sophia and me, there's just no way that anything like this can happen without the support of an entire institution. Rachel Hammer, I think I mentioned, Mike Barsanti, Fran Dolan, Ariel Middleman, Joe Placeres, Carlton Golds, Linda August, Sarah Weatherwax, Connie King, Em Ricciardi, Elizabeth Yang, Andrea Krupp. Extra special thanks to Ann Nista, Erica Piola, Tristan Dan, Emily Smith. These are my thanks, by the way. If I've missed anyone, Sophia was probably already mentioning them. And the indomitable Jennifer Rosner, who on the last day that this exhibition was being installed was also Jennifer's official retirement day. And that is bittersweet. Sweet for her, I'm just bitter. And the greatest thanks of all from me to Sophia, because while I might have started this whole project a while back, if Sophia had not been on board and with me every step of the way, it would not have happened, full stop. And furthermore, most of the content in that exhibition space was produced by Sophia. Sophia is just, she's fantastic. So just keep that in mind. You will be seeing lots more from her. Not right away. She's going to let her take a rest. I also want to say that for me personally, I dedicate this exhibition to my grandfather, Salvatore Ezzo, who suffered with major mental illness issues after World War II and received shock therapy, electric shock therapy, and insulin shock therapy. And his life and the lives of his family members was forever changed because of that, for good and ill. I'll briefly mention that there will be an online exhibition that will be up in about a month or so. And we are also having an event on August 20th that will be an art therapy based event. So you'll be seeing more about that. Registration is open currently. We're also going to stay after the talk and have a some more time to eat, to drink, to chat, to look at the exhibition. So please feel free to do that. And I will turn this over to Sophia. Oh, no.
Rachel said that this exhibition speaks for itself, and it really does. And in many ways, it does so quite literally. You might notice in the exhibition hall that there are QR codes next to some of the books on display. We, Rachel and I, thought it was really important to try and bring these texts to life as much as we could. So we hired a group of actors to come in and recite passages from a selection of the narratives. Those are available to listen through those QR codes in the gallery. And those actors, I want to thank personally for making this exhibition far more than it would have been without them. They are Stephen Peitzman, David Swartz, Michael Kirst-Crahel, Charlotte Kirkby, Elizabeth Yang, Lori Hardy, Hannah Rappaport-Stein, and Mary Kirst-Crahel. I do hope that you listen to those narratives, because I've found that they really bring to life those narratives and allow you as a visitor to connect with those people on a hopefully more personal level. I'd also like to thank a number of our lenders who contributed materials to this show that really upped the ante. Those are the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Hospital Historic Collections, and Bill and Charlene Stevens, who loaned us the quilt that's in the hallway out there. Thank you.
And so now I would like to introduce Christine Newley, who is with Lanternfish Press and as the editorial director of Lanternfish Press. And we'll hear a little bit about what they do and why we're so excited to be working with them. Then we'll continue from there. Come on up, Christine.
Hello. As Rachel mentioned, I'm the editorial director of Lanternfish Press. We are a small independent publishing company founded here in Philadelphia in 2013. We publish what we call the literature of the rare and strange, which includes work that breaks the boundaries between literary and speculative fiction. So everything from magical realist coming of age narratives to spirit haunted Southern Gothics to poetic cyberpunk. It also includes both fiction and nonfiction that really achieves the feat of bringing estranged times and places into focus for the contemporary reader. And we like to say that we're a home for books that defy pigeonholes and for the readers who love them. We semi-recently expanded our catalog to include our beautiful Clockwork Editions series, which are reprints and anthologies of Victorian and Edwardian era literature. We look for books that are of interest both to potentially to a general reader and also useful in the classroom, this being one of those. Unfortunately, due to supply chain issues, we do not have new copies of That Calamity for sale here tonight. The official release date has been moved back to May 24th. I heard they shipped to our warehouse today. You can, however, pre-order the book at our website, lanternfishpress.com. And very soon it will be available for sale everywhere else. I did bring some copies of previous Clockwork editions if anyone is curious and would like to see, including Medusa's Daughters, edited by Theodora Goss, which contains another one of the narratives that's in the exhibition out here, the yellow wallpaper. And we are really delighted to add to that series John Perceval's Memoir of Mental Illness and Recovery, edited by Lindsey Grubbs, who will be speaking to you tonight. When we were doing the early work for this project, we came over here to the reading room at the library company and we did reading on a number of narratives. And there were kind of two groups that were really interesting. There were the ones where someone was locked up on a terrible excuse, like, your religious beliefs don't make sense to me, or like, I would like to cover up my illegitimate child, or whatever it is, that where completely sane people were locked up in asylums, which was under the laws at the time very easy to do. The other group was people who, although they didn't have the same diagnostic codes at the time as we do now, were people who genuinely seemed to suffer from real mental illness. And this is one of those. And I enjoy it particularly as an insight into someone who did need treatment and was getting society at the time's best guess as to what might benefit him. So I'm very happy to introduce Lindsey Grubbs, who is a member of the faculty in the Department of Public Health at California State University, East Bay, where she teaches courses in ethics and humanities. She has a doctorate in English and postdoctoral training in bioethics, and she researches the cultural history and contemporary ethics of psychiatry and neuroscience. And I would love to thank her for her brilliant and painstaking work bringing this out of print memoir to life. Thank you.
Okay, the exhibit speaks for itself. The book does not, so I'm going to talk for longer than that. I'm so happy to be here. Oh, you need a minute, Blanche, to pull it up. Good. Good. I'm very happy to be here today speaking with all of you. Thanks so much to the library company and to Lanternfish Books for hosting this event, Rachel and Sophia for this amazing exhibit, Blanche for planning the event and making sure that it and my slides run smoothly here. I am especially, we go back one actually, hold on, we're not quite ready. Beautiful, thank you. So I'm especially happy to be here because I'm a library company super fan. I did a fellowship here during my dissertation. It was split between here and the Drexel University College of Medicine archives. And it was one of the best months of my PhD. I spent a lot of time in this reading room with Connie King, learning how to use a physical bibliography, learning that that was a thing that existed, for example, and just learning how to work with the archival materials that formed the basis of my dissertation. And that dissertation, which I'm working on developing into a book, looked at the relationship between literature and the development of psychiatric diagnosis in the 19th century US. Both how physicians drew on literary tropes as they were trying to form new categories, and also how those categories then got disseminated through literature. And I was here primarily to work with the collections, the papers of Benjamin Rush, so-called father of American psychiatry, and they are tremendous, and I found a great deal in them. But I also had some more time to poke around, and that time I used to find some other materials. The The best search you can do in the library company catalog, if you're looking for history of psychiatry, is just to search Rosenberg. And then everything that he's donated will pop up. I used that strategy. And I came across one of much less known figure in the history of psychiatry. If I could get a slide now, you guys all got the preview. But this is the memoir of Isaac Hunt, Astounding Disclosures, 3 Years in a Madhouse by a Victim. Isaac Hunt was put in the Maine Insane Asylum for 3 years. And he published an 84-page pamphlet about his treatment in that asylum. He knew that this text would be met with doubt, and you can see him saying here, "Start not, think not that a madman raves. I shall utter naught but truth, truth so strong and reason so palpable that nothing short of sheer innate madness or stupidity of your own shall close your eye or ear to the cogent force and ends I have in view." He takes on the language of the medical establishment. He says that he will lay open, expose, anatomize, and exhibit the practices of the asylum to cast light on the failures of them all. He admits that he was a wild maniac in his own words. I will throughout this talk use the original historical language just as a note. But he says he had a brain fever. He was in the asylum for that reason. But once he got there, the practices within the asylum heightened fear, and he believed that the attendants were doing things to try to create paranoia among patients. The pamphlet has a really extreme tone, and I think it would be really easy to dismiss it as evidence of mental disorder. But that if we check that impulse and take it really seriously, it gives us really important insights into the experience of patients, the management of the asylum, the tone of the relationships between patients and between the patients and their physicians. And that these kinds of texts can offer a really important counterweight to the letters and lecture notes and publications of the prominent physicians who are developing this new specialty within medicine. And as this exhibit shows, Hunt was just one of many of these accounts that occurred in the 19th century. And I think both in their own time and today, they were too often ignored entirely or taken as a sort of curiosity. And so I think that exhibits like this one are especially important as we try to sketch out a fuller picture of life in the asylum in the 19th century through the voices of the people most impacted. So all of this is prologue to say, could I get another slide here, that I was very excited when the library company reached out about writing the introduction and notes for Lanternfish Book's new edition of John Perceval's memoir. I will give the full title here. It is a narrative of the treatment experienced by a gentleman during a state of mental derangement, designed to explain the causes and the nature of insanity and to expose the injudicious conduct pursued towards many unfortunate sufferers under that calamity. I will admit I was not familiar with this text, but it took very little preliminary research before I knew that I wanted to be. Particularly, I was interested in learning that Perceval was one of the founding members of an early advocacy group called the Alleged Lunatics Friends Society, who were dedicated both to protecting the sane from unjust incarceration, but also to improving conditions for people who were in asylums regardless of their mental state. So in England, as here at the time, it was very easy to have someone put away. You just needed 2 certificates that had been signed by medical doctors certifying them certifiable as mad. And there were a lot of well-publicized cases of people who were sane being placed in asylums when their families conspired with physicians. Perceval and his peers in the Alleged Lunatics Friends Society, which included quite a few people who had been in asylums previously, engaged in a lot of different kinds of advocacy. They were doing campaigns in the press. There was some direct action trying to spring people from asylums and speaking to Parliament on behalf of reforms. And when Perceval addressed Parliament, he referred to himself as the Attorney General of all Her Majesty's madmen. He earned that title through lived experience. During a period of religious delusion around 1830, His family placed him in the Brislington House. It was a reformed asylum, an elite asylum run by the Fox family. After 13 months of treatment, or he would suggest despite 13 months of treatment, he believed he had been cured. But instead of being freed at this point, he was transferred to another asylum where he would spend another 2 years. There are two accounts that he writes that have the exact same name, 1838 and 1840. And the one that is being republished now is the first. It's an account of the onset of his disorder and of his mistreatment in this first asylum. So to back up a bit, Perceval was one of 13 children of the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, who was assassinated when the younger Perceval was 9. He went to an elite school, he was given a military commission, and he served for a time without combat, and then he left because his religious principles did not match up with the work he was being asked to do in the military. He went to Oxford for a little while and then left again to pursue spiritual life. There were rumors that in Scotland there were miracles occurring, that there was a religious sect that was doing faith healings, speaking in tongues, and he and his brother went up to go see for themselves. And it was this environment that he said sort of sparked the onset of disorder for him. Which makes sense in a context in which hearing voices and saying incomprehensible things was the highest marker of religious devotion. There was this really muddy line between spirituality and pathology. It sounds like even in this context, his behavior struck his fellow people as a little strange, but it wasn't until later that he had real strong cause for concern. He left for Dublin, where he contracted syphilis from an encounter with a sex worker, and the sort of shame and hypocrisy that he felt. He said that he began to hear divine voices that were giving him the opposite instructions of the physician that was prescribing him medications, and this is where things really fell apart for him. But it was at this moment when he began to be seen as mad and his family restrained him in an inn that he thought that their reason had fled. He thought that because they handed over his care in this moment to this new specialty of lunatic doctors, that they had kind of given over their own reason. And he says of his doctor, he submitted me to the treatment of a lunatic doctor and submitted his own judgment along with it. He was particularly upset about this, and this is sort of a theme for him throughout the book, because this family placed the word of a physician who was a working man over his own as a gentleman, which he took as a particular insult. He does acknowledge the seriousness of his delusions, that he was hearing voices that encouraged him to do self-harm, to kill himself, but he writes that he wants people to have treated him differently. Specifically, he wishes his brother had engaged with him, had spoken with him about the reasons that he was having for having these thoughts, to kind of have a conversation as opposed to sort of closing the door and locking him away. So he thinks that the treatment that he received escalated his symptoms. If I could get another slide, there's a lot of words here, but he gives basically the spark notes of his entire treatment in this long paragraph here, and sort of stresses what he sees as the absurdity. So, tie an active-limbed, active-minded, actively imagining young man in bed, hand and foot, for a fortnight. Drench him with medicine, slops, clysters. When reduced to the extreme of nervous debility and his derangement is successfully confirmed, manacle him down for 24 hours in the cabin of a ship. Then for a whole year, shut him up from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., regardless of his former habits, in a room full of strangers, ranting, noisy, quarrelsome, revolting madmen. Give him no tonic medicines, no peculiar treatment or attention. Leave him to a nondescript domestic, now brushing his clothes, sweeping the floors, serving at table, now his companion out of doors, now his bedroom companion, now throwing him on the floor, kneeling on him, striking him under all these distressing and perplexing circumstances. Debar him from all conversation with his superiors, all communication with his friends, all insight into their motives, every impression of sane and well-behaved society. Surprise him on all occasions, never leave him harassing him day or night or at meals. Whether you bleed him to death or cut his hair, show the same utter contempt for his will or inclination. Do all in your power to crush every germ of self-respect that may yet remain or rise up in his bosom. Manacle him as you would a felon, expose him to ridicule, and give him no opportunity of retirement or self-reflection. And what are you to expect? He gives this history at length in the book that we've republished. Those who read the writing of the Fox family who ran the asylum would have a very different impression that their care was gentle, mostly support for exercise, the building of new regular habits. And his narrative stresses not just that they didn't always live up to their ideals there, but also when it was working as designed, this new gentle treatment was still degrading and oppressive. His memoir offers us a look inside the asylum, sometimes through the clarity of his critiques, and sometimes by reading through the kind of snobbishness of his complaints about being forced into contact with low-class attendants or physicians that were below his class, and his disgust occasionally at being forced into rooms with people who had symptoms more striking than his own. But so while he was in the asylum at a really optimistic time for the profession, where they believed that cure was possible through asylum, he said that his own faith in medical progress was much less clear. He refused to call it an asylum. He calls it a madhouse, and really stresses that. So if I could get a slide, just so you don't have to look at all these words. So one of the things that I think is most interesting, and this came up already, was that he talks about both his mental disorder and his unfair treatment. So a lot of these popular memoirs that you can see in this exhibit are about wrongful confinement, people who were perfectly sane, but their families conspired with doctors to put them away because of religious or personal problems, like the American Elizabeth Ware Packard, who was put in an asylum by her husband. And these are really crucial narratives that show how diagnosis can be weaponized against people who don't fit in or people who don't have much power. But I think that it's also incredibly and equally powerful to see the narrative of somebody who fully admits that he had lost his reason. It's the opening line of the text. And he spends his time talking both about his symptoms, his medical symptoms, and critiquing the medical system. So he would later be part of the group that was working for alleged lunatics, but he's also incredibly interested in sort of the confessed lunatic. Writers like Perceval and Packard, with the organizations, the Alleged Lunatics Friends Society and the Anti-Insane Asylum Society, worked to show how diagnoses could be weaponized against those who didn't fit in, and how genuine care was not always given to those who most needed their kindness. And in this way, they sort of forecast later civil rights struggles. And it's not a surprise that this text was republished in the context of new reevaluations of psychiatric power in the 1960s. There was a series of exposés in the 40s and 50s of asylum conditions, and there was a new wave of anti-psychiatric or anti-institutional sentiment that rivaled the mid-19th century. And in this context, the anthropologist Gregory Bateson republished in 1961 Perceval's narratives. It went through quite a few printings, and it was anthologized in a few different collections that were designed to show patient voices. In the 1970s, alongside other freedom struggles, the Mad Pride movement was taking form through groups like the Insane Liberation Front and the Mental Patients Liberation Project. So if I could get a slide here. A lot of the Mad Pride movement, as summarized by Bradley Lewis, had three sort of main tenets: decentering psychiatry and psychiatrists, increasing peer networks and peer support, as well as removing coercion and state power from mental health treatment. And today, I think it's very easy to imagine, given that all three of these were major tenets of Perceval's work, that he might be working alongside people in groups like Mind Freedom International. Their website is up on the top left here. who emphasize alternatives to coercive treatment, as well as the Hearing Voices Network down on the bottom right, who work against pathologizing models and argue even just for this shift from the phrase auditory hallucination towards hearing voices. So if I could get a slide. These protest histories shaped my editorial strategy for this volume, and I tried to preserve as much of Perceval's voice as possible. The 60s edition, the Bateson edition, collapses both of the memoirs into one, and it cuts out some chapters that it says are contentious and repetitive. And I tried to take a bit of a lighter touch here. There are a few alterations, things that felt like typographical rather than stylistic choices, like extra spacing in some places, obvious errors, doubled words, were for where, that kind of thing. And this is a good place to shout out again, Rachel, who helped me a great deal with the manuscript here. I did leave a few things that I thought could be his grammatical choices untouched. So if I could get another slide. This is a small piece of that big long quote I showed you before, and you can see that he uses an exclamation point sort of mid-sentence here. Yes, thank you very much, Blanche. That every impression of sane and well-behaved society surprised him on all occasions. We don't get a full stop. We don't end the sentence. He just kind of runs on into another lowercase there in place of a comma. This could be meaningless. It could not have been his choice at all. It could just be something the printer did. But I tried to be sort of agnostic about these decisions rather than reading too much into them. I think sometimes when we are reading historical texts, the impulse can be sort of root around and try to get to the bottom of things, to maybe diagnose the author, or to try to find the real story through the lens of an unreliable narrator. And we all know historical documents should be read with a really critical eye, right? Like everybody has a perspective, everybody has a bias, everybody has an agenda. But I was struck when I was reading an article about Perceval that somebody talks about his account saying it is a highly colored account that needs to be treated with caution, but may contain an element of truth. But in that same article, we have another source, which was the advertising pamphlet put out by the Fox family themselves. And we don't get the same sort of marker warning us, even though that's about as colored of an account as you can get. So when looking at texts like this, I do my best to try to see mental disorder as just one of the many identities that's shaping the text. And actually in this text, I think often his wealth, his wealth and his privilege tend to shape the text a bit more. He's pretty clear-sighted about his mental symptoms and when he was experiencing them. Less clear-sighted about the privilege part. So one of the last decisions that we had to make for this volume was images. The original was not illustrated, so we looked around again, shout out Rachel, looked around for images. Many of them are over in this exhibit right now that would get on some of those key themes. So if we could get one image over. So some of these are images from other memoirs that talked about similar themes. So this is Juliet Workman's expose. This is forced bathing. This was one of his biggest complaints about the first asylum. He, I believe, sued or tried to sue them for it after he left. Another one, please, another slide. Another forced feeding here. One more. This is an image from the Fox's promotional pamphlet. You can see it looks quite nice. We've got a dog frolicking in the front. We've got a happy family here. Quite a nice scene. And then one more. This is an illustration from Escarol's textbook on mental illness, which was published in the same year as the Perceval text. And I had some doubts about including this because he had obviously not the best opinion of medical doctors. But I think that the directness of the gaze here, if this is supposed to be sort of a pathological specimen, really medicalized, it just strikes me as a failure. And the confrontational direct gaze really reminded me of Perceval's own approach. So to close, I want to stress that memoirs like Perceval's can be really profound resources for learning about the history of psychiatry rather than curiosities of it. He was aware that every single word he wrote would be seen as evidence of pathology, but not put off, he and others suggested that no one knew better than them. Against the backdrop of the rising profession of psychiatry, he made the claim that expertise should be seen in reverse. So if I could get one more slide, I think, thank you. He writes, feeling the ignorance to be in one sense real, which all of you confess on your lips, listen to one who can instruct you. Reminding his readers that there are experts in insanity who do not have medical degrees, he requests humility and attention. As this wonderful exhibit that you are all going to go look at or already have shows, this was just one of the publications by those incarcerated against their will. And incorporating their voices fully into our historical portraits is one really important step. But we also need to remember to ask which pieces of that portrait are still missing. Obviously, these accounts really help us unsettle a traditional physician-centered history of medicine. But Perceval especially is a really good case that it's people that have the financial and the social power to get these in print and to get them distributed are the ones whose voices we can recover most easily. Even wealthy white male mental patients had a really hard time being taken seriously. And even though many of the most popular accounts were written by white women, there are really striking gaps in the genre of the asylum narrative, which are structured by race, by class, by disability, by continued incarceration, not having gotten out in the first place. So listening to the voices of the 19th century asylum in the archive requires that we approach that history with humility, creativity, and attention to the things that go unsaid. Thank you very much. Oh, side camera.
I'm just going to pop in here real quick to explain what's going to happen next. We're going to have some Q&A. We've got, we can take questions from the audience. And if that happens, we are going to bring around a small spaceship looking gizmo so that you can ask your question into it so that the folks on Zoom can hear you. And questions for Lindsey are ideal. If you must ask a question for Sophia or me, we'll of course answer that. We'll also be here after, because when we finish up in about 15 minutes, we'll still have time to go check out the exhibition, grab another nosh, something to drink, and just chill and catch us with questions. I also, before questions, I must correct an error that I made, which was to fail to thank our funders. And that, as you all should know, is crucial, crucial, crucial. So just a moment to thank the Gladys Prebel Del Mas Foundation, the Walter J. Miller Trust, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, and the Louise Luck Zions and Harry Zions Endowment. Thank you very much for that. And we can take your questions now. I have to take off my mask.
Just embarrassing my wife because I always have a question. One thing I was struck with in looking through some of the presentation materials was there was a lot of reference to moral care, and that kind of came up a lot. And I just wondered if you kind of compare and contrast the kind of moral care emphasis that seemed to be evidenced in the 19th century to what I guess I would describe as more kind of clinical approach and almost like, who cares about the humanity? Let's get the drugs right. Kind of, would you think that's a fair characterization, or how do you think the profession is developing these days, and what can the history perhaps show us?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your question. I'm glad you wanted to embarrass your wife. Yeah, I mean, I actually think sometimes that 19th century, the history of 19th century mental health care seems more familiar to care today than a large portion of the 20th century. I think that they were approaching it very much. There was this idea of moral treatment, that we can try to get people to think differently, to approach their problems differently, to get exercise, who among us has not been told that we just need to go for a run if we're having a bad stretch. And I think, you know, working on your habits, put down your phone before bed for 3 hours or whatever. I think a lot of that feels very familiar now. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Perceval is that he's in a place that's doing moral treatment specifically. But they were also doing quite a lot of medical treatments. The idea, the cold showers he was being given, he was bled, he had an operation on his temporal artery at one point that were supposed to be very physically based cures. And so this sort of sense of the integration between physical cures and emotional cures and how tightly those two were connected. The idea that if we change somebody's habits, we are changing their body and letting them approach things differently. It's still, to me, it feels very familiar. Some of the sort of pre-psychoanalytic 19th century stuff feels a lot like how we talk about it today.
Yeah.
I have a question. Do you know if there are current projects with all of the oral histories that are going on today? Are there current projects for first-person narratives for people who are struggling with mental health or institutionalized today?
I'll take the first round, which is to say, I don't know of any offhand. I do. One of the pictures that I didn't put up is I have a whole section of my bookshelf that's memoirs, right? That these remain incredibly popular. The idea that people are going to write about their experience and try to tell people. So I'm more familiar with the published side, which again has a lot of those same caveats of the people who are getting published are the people who can get published. But yeah, I don't know. Are you have anything?
All I can add to that is that I think what people share on social media will, you know, has allowed for a conversation in a way that, you know, didn't exist in the past, but how folks are saving and sharing that content for the future. I think there are a lot of questions yet to be answered. I will say that in the fall, we do not have anything nailed down yet, but we are intending to have a program here at the library company in which we will specifically address both the history, far back and more recent history, as well as the current state and hopeful future of mental health care. So keep your eyes open for that, and maybe we can all learn an answer to that question together.
I'm asking a question on behalf of America Patton, who is attending virtually this evening. Do you think that Crucible, maybe Perceval, realized that his writings would be used as a discussion piece to help diverse leaders discover more ways to improve mental health care in 21st century America?
I just realized that the camera's over here, so I'm going to look this way. Sorry, everybody. I think he certainly had that idea. I think he's a man with a great deal of confidence, and some of that confidence is in how interested people will be to read what he has written. And he really did see it that way. And sort of the second narrative too, it's longer. It goes on at more length, and he says, "I'll write another one if I think you guys want to hear that." And I think he did. He really took the public stage. He really thought, I think that one of the things that's really striking about his history is that he did not, like, as was already mentioned, he didn't see a lot of the reforms. He had a lot of very clear agendas that he wanted to see. A lot of those did not happen while he was alive, but many of them happened either shortly after he died or have happened more recently. I think that he had a real clarity of vision about what needed to change, and that in writing he was very much hoping that people would. So I don't know that whether he thought to the 21st century, but he clearly was trying to get something down for posterity, and he had a lot to say. Yeah.
And Connie King, who is joining us virtually, asks, does the concept of causality show up? Do people talk about having been, quote unquote, driven mad by circumstance, especially women in a nascent feminism, in quotes?
Yes, he definitely relates a good deal of this to his spiritual experiences, to his time with the Irvingites as the group that he is working with, and he sees that as sort of something that unsettles him, as his experience with religion. I know, I mean, if you look at admissions books for asylums at this time, there are both kinds of causes really prominently figured. You'll see things like disappointed in business, disappointed in love. Religion is probably the most common, but then you'll also see like was bumped on the head, births, like there's both calls out to sort of physical and to mental causes, what we would now think of as physical and mental causes, but he certainly thinks that religion has a great deal to do with it in his case, at least.
I'll just quickly add on to that in our collections, we have a lot of annual reports of asylums, and in those, they often will include these data, including, you know, the reasons for admission. And so it's tempting to find oneself quite bemused when the death of a president seems to have turned several people mad in one particular year or something along those lines. But yes, they are looking at this causality, and I may very well be wrong about this, but I believe that one of the Prime Minister Perceval's sons was with him when he was assassinated, and there is a thought that that might have been our author Perceval, and so part of his insanity had a much deeper seated cause in the trauma of seeing his father murdered.
Sophia, this is a question specific to you. So if I will give you time to rise to the podium, yes. So this is a question from Judith Rufo, who's joining us virtually this evening. Judith asks, Sophia, what criteria did you use to select items for the exhibit?
Well, you know, for the narratives, the choice really wasn't that hard. It kind of came down to what we had in our collections and what we could get. But we wanted specifically first-person narratives. In terms of the artwork that's on display, our parameters were a bit wider. We selected artworks that were not always created in the asylum, but we did want to find out more about the artists themselves. So we do know that all of the artwork was created by people who did suffer from mental illness. Whether or not it was created while in the asylum, before or after, you know, we weren't too picky about that. But yeah, you know, most everything that we have is included in the exhibition. There are a couple of items that I think we found one online that like a week before the show went up. So that one couldn't make it into the show because it just didn't get here in time. And there were a few things that didn't make it in just because our cases weren't big enough. And so in those cases, you know, we just tried to find the stories that were really compelling and really added to the overall narrative of the show. But luckily we didn't have to make a whole lot of cuts. So we're fortunate for that.
Well, this is a question from me. It's a follow-up question, and for listening virtually, me is Blanche. And I want to ask about the significance of like the first person narrative. And if you could talk a little bit about why that was such an emphasis for the two of you as curators.
Thank you for that question. That does give me an opportunity to talk briefly about some of our other academic programs here, because what we have several programs that were built upon the strengths of our collection. The program in African American history, women's history program, visual culture program, program in early American economy and society, popular medicine. I'm not sure if I'm missing anything. I apologize if I am. I think that's it. But essentially what we have been doing more and more in recent years is each of the curators that focuses on those programs is really trying to center the voices of the individuals who are represented in that history. So in other words, while we have certainly a number of works on abolitionism as well as your pro-slavery, less of that, but a lot of abolitionist materials that were written by white folks, we've in recent years decided that what we want to spend our acquisition funds on in the program in African American history is trying to work really hard to bring in more voices of African Americans. So that is inspired me personally to want to do a show about the history of mental health, but as much as possible, focus on the voices of those who experienced it as patients. So why though? I mean, I think it's only fair for one thing, but also they provided that voice, right? In these narratives, they wanted to be heard. For a number of different reasons, and we want to respect that and say, well, their voices are incredibly important, and their stories are also interesting and compelling. But I think that, you know, it's just much easier and has been the status quo to really tell history through institutional histories or through the stories of, you know, the winners, as it were, or the most dominant members of a society. And so I think not just Sophia and me, but in the world generally, people are really trying to look at history from a new lens these days as much as possible. And so we're trying to be part of that endeavor. Thanks.
Okay, I think that wraps up our questions for the evening. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, both in person and virtually. For those attending virtually, thank you and have a good night. For those of you here in person, we hope you'll hang out a bit longer, enjoy some more refreshments, take a look at the exhibition if you haven't had the chance to yet. And if you're attending virtually, we invite you to 1314 Locust Street. We're open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4:45 p.m. if you want to look at the exhibition. We hope to see you soon, and thank you again.